Welcome, everyone, to this week's lecture in which we will begin our discussion of the endocrine system. The endocrine system is used to transmit a message from one organ in the body to another using the circulatory system as the delivery method. The hypothalamus and the pituitary glands play a major role in the endocrine system, and we will get to them shortly. But first, let's talk about the endocrine system in general terms. Think of the endocrine system like a postal service, where a chemical message is addressed and packaged in one gland, secreted in the circulatory system, and then this message finds the chemical address of the appropriate cells in other organs. The chemical message is called the hormone, and it will circulate throughout the entire body, but only create an effect in tissues with the appropriate receptor, the target cells. Most hormones travel great distances to reach the target cells, but there are instances where a gland known as a paracrine gland would release hormones that would have an effect on nearby cells, or even a gland which acts directly on the same cells that secreted the hormone. This is known as an autocrine gland. This system can be contrasted to the exocrine system, which consists of ducts that secrete a substance to the external environment, outside the tissues of the body. For instance, this could be the intestines, in the lungs, or on the surface of skin. The secreted substance is processed in the duct and does not enter the circulation like it does in the endocrine system. Some examples of the exocrine system would be sweat glands, salivary glands, mammary glands, bile duct glands in the liver, and others. But in this unit, we are concentrating on the endocrine system. So let's start with a description of the chemical message itself, the hormone. Hormones can be composed of two types of chemical substances, proteins or steroids. Protein hormones would consist of amino acids, peptides, amines, or proteins. Once produced, these hormones are packaged into secretion granules ready for release into circulation. If not immediately released, protein hormones may be stored in secretory vesicles ready for immediate release on demand. With the exception of thyroid hormones, protein hormones travel freely in the plasma and do not need to be bound to carrier molecules. These hormones have relatively short half-lives. Here you can see the pathway of a protein hormone as it enters the cell. You can see it's a water-soluble hormone, but the membrane is insoluble. So they must bind to these membrane receptors. The binding to these receptors activates something called a G protein, which then activates an enzyme called adenyl cyclase. The adenyl cyclase then catalyzes the conversion of ATP to cyclic AMP, which is a secondary messenger in the cell. The cyclic AMP then will activate different protein kinases, and these protein kinases then will phosphorylate proteins in the cytoplasm, which activates proteins, allowing them to alter the cell activity. So you can see here that it's actually a multi-enzymatic pathway that is activated by the hormone outside the cell. The other type of hormone composition would be a steroid hormone. All steroid hormones are made from a precursor molecule, cholesterol. The hormone is synthesized in the cell cytoplasm by a multi-enzyme process and are not packaged in vesicles, so there are no reserves. In other words, no steroid hormones are stored in cells. The hydrophobic nature of steroid hormones require that they be transported bound to a specific plasma protein. This gives them much longer half-lives as compared to protein hormones, but only the free unbound hormone is biologically active. Because the unbound steroid hormones has a lipid composition, they then freely diffuse across the lipid cell membrane. In this case, we're looking at a lipid-soluble hormone or a steroid hormone, and you can see then as it leaves the circulatory system, it will have been carried by a protein because it's not water soluble, so to be carried in circulation, it will have been carried by a protein. But then it's going to leave circulation when it finds a cell, and it can diffuse directly through the plasma membrane of the cell because the plasma membrane is lipid. After it gets through the membrane, the hormone will bind with a receptor in the cytoplasm, forming a receptor hormone complex. And this complex can enter the nucleus. From there, in the nucleus, it will trigger a specific gene transcription, and the transcribed messenger RNA will then be translated finally into proteins that will alter the cell activity. In order to ensure homeostasis, the maintenance of equilibrium as is required in all living cells, a feedback system is employed in all endocrine systems. By far, the most common feedback system used is the negative feedback system, also known as the negative feedback loop. This mechanism prevents the overactive production and stimulation of the endocrine system because the mechanism is inhibited by its own products. The final hormone product in this pathway inhibits the secretion of one or more precursor hormones, and therefore the concentration of the final hormone will determine the level of inhibition. The positive feedback loop is only rarely found in living systems and is used to stimulate an exponential increase in the hormone for a very fast response. In this system, the higher levels of the end product will stimulate the further production of the product. One important example of a positive feedback loop is the time just before ovulation in the female reproductive cycle, also known as the LH estrogen cycle. We will be discussing this system in the reproductive hormones unit at a later date. Here you can see an illustration of negative feedback. In this case, we're going to be looking at the, let's use the thyroid pathway as an example. Okay, so in this case, the hypothalamus would release a hormone called TRH, thyroid releasing hormone, which would travel through circulation and reach the anterior pituitary. In the anterior pituitary, the TRH would then stimulate the release of a hormone called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. The thyroid stimulating hormone would be secreted into circulation, where it would circulate all over the body, but it would reach the thyroid gland, which would have receptors for this hormone. Once the TSH reaches the thyroid gland and connects with those receptors, it will release T3 and T4, the target gland hormones. The T3 and T4, as illustrated here by hormones coming out of the target glands, will inhibit both the anterior pituitary production of TSH and the hypothalamic production of TRH. And you can see here there's other hormones that are listed here which would use this cycle. Now let's look at the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Here is an illustration of the brain inside the skull. And if you look at that orange area there, that is the area underneath the hypothalamus. The orange area is the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is right above that in the brain, right below the thalamus. Hypo means below. So you can see then in the picture illustration on the left, you can see the third ventricle, and right below that is the hypothalamus. Then there is a stalk below the hypothalamus which is very vascular and leads to the anterior pituitary. And behind that, so we're looking from front to back where the anterior pituitary can be seen. And then if you look at the bottom there, you can see protruding from the bottom is the back of the pituitary or the posterior pituitary gland. Here's a better illustration of the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. So you can see here up in the top here, you'll see the hypothalamic section, and you can see the neurons starting from the top there, the hypothalamic neurons, okay? Then you can see in the front, which is to the left here, is the anterior pituitary. The alternate name for the anterior pituitary is the adenohypophysis. And then on the back, you can see the posterior pituitary gland, also known as the neurohypophysis. This diagram compares the adenohypophysis with the neurohypophysis, or the anterior pituitary with the posterior pituitary. So here on the left, we can see the illustration of how the anterior pituitary reacts with, or interacts with, I should say, with the hypothalamus. So you can see in the hypothalamus there are neurons, and these neurons only extend into the stalk below the hypothalamus. In those neurons, they are producing what we call releasing hormones or releasing factors. And you can see they're different colors, and that's supposed to represent that they are producing different releasing hormones. These releasing hormones then are released into circulation, this portal circulation. You see that circulatory center right around the stalk? That's supposed to represent a portal circulation, which is just mainly circulation between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So once these releasing hormones are released into that portal circulation, they move down into the anterior pituitary and have receptors in the cells in the anterior pituitary specific for the hormones that will be released by those specific cells. So in other words, TRH will be released, say the green neuron in the hypothalamus, thyroid releasing hormone, that will travel down into portal circulation, and only those cells which make TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, will be stimulated by the TRH. Once those cells are stimulated, TSH will be released into the main circulation where it will go throughout the body and will find a connection with the receptors in the thyroid gland. The neurohypophysis, or posterior pituitary, is a little bit different. It has a little bit different relationship with the hypothalamus. So if you see in this diagram on the right, the hypothalamus has neurons which start in the hypothalamus. And you can see the cell bodies are in the hypothalamus, but then the axons extend all the way down and into the posterior pituitary, so that in the cell body there are hormones that are made and produced, and they will be transported down the axons and released in the posterior pituitary. So there is not two sets of hormones in this case, one for the hypothalamus and one for the posterior pituitary. There is just one hormone that's made. And you can see that there's actually two different colors here instead of the 5 that we saw with the adenohypophysis. In the neurohypophysis, there's only 2 different hormones. So they have a gray and a red here to represent that. And we're going to talk about those different ones in just a minute. So here we see the hormones that are produced by the neurohypophysis and the adenohypophysis. Remember, on the left here, the neurohypophysis produces hormones in the cell body in the hypothalamus, but then they are released in the posterior pituitary. So you can see those 2 hormones here. They are oxytocin and ADH. And the target glands for oxytocin are the uterine muscles and the mammary glands, and for ADH are the kidney tubules. On the right here, we see the relationship once again between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. And so you can see the releasing factors are released in the hypothalamus into that portal circulation, and those releasing hormones reach the anterior pituitary gland and stimulates specific cells to release their hormones. So you can see that 6 are listed here. Actually 7 if you count FSH and LH as separate. So the thyroid stimulating hormone is released from the anterior pituitary, and that will reach the target gland of the thyroid. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, will be released from the adenohypophysis, and that target gland would be the adrenal cortex. Both FSH and LH will reach the gonads, which is their target organ. Growth hormone will reach all the cells of the body. Prolactin will reach the mammary glands. And finally, endorphins, which we're not going to talk a lot about in this course, they will reach the pain receptors in the brain. So here we have a chart for you so that you can go over the hypothalamic hormones. You'll see that I have listed in the central column here where they will stimulate an action. So either in the adenohypophysis or in the neurohypophysis. And you can see the first 7 of them are listed for the adenohypophysis. So these are all going to be releasing hormones. Okay, so corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH. Oh, and by the way, you do have to know both the full names and the abbreviated names. Okay, so CRH is released in the hypothalamus and will activate the release of ACTH in the adenohypophysis. Thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, is produced in the hypothalamus and then will circulate to the adenohypophysis to release TSH. The gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, will be released from the hypothalamus, circulate to the adenohypophysis, and that will cause the release of FSH and LH from the adenohypophysis. Prolactin inhibiting factor and prolactin releasing factor are both released in the hypothalamus and will circulate to the adenohypophysis. And the first one, the inhibiting factor, will decrease prolactin production, whereas the releasing factor will increase the production of prolactin. GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, is produced by the hypothalamus, circulates to the adenohypophysis, and will cause the release of growth hormone. Melanocyte inhibiting factor is released by the hypothalamus and will circulate to the adenohypophysis, and that will decrease MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. So those are the possible anterior pituitary hormones, those are the possible anterior pituitary stimulating releasing factors or releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. The 2 hormones listed here that are produced in the hypothalamus and released in the posterior pituitary are antidiuretic hormone, which will reach the kidney tubules and will reach the kidney tubules and cause the reabsorption of water. And finally, oxytocin, which once again is produced in the hypothalamus and released in the posterior pituitary, and that will stimulate uterine contraction. Here is a list of the pituitary hormones. So you can see I've listed 5 areas here. These are called tropic hormones because they cause the release of another hormone from another gland. Okay? So in the first case, in the anterior pituitary or adenohypophysis, we have the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, which the target gland is the adrenal cortex, and that will cause the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex. We have the gonadotropin, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, FSH and LH, and they are the target tissue in that case is the reproductive organs, or the gonads, the ovaries, and the testes, and that will cause oogenesis and spermatogenesis, and also ovulation in their respective glands. The next one would be thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. That will reach the target gland of the thyroid, and that stimulates the secretion of thyroid hormones T3 and T4, which increase cellular metabolism in most cells. The next hormone that is released from the adenohypophysis is growth hormone, and that will reach most tissues of the body and stimulate growth via protein synthesis in those cells. And then finally, prolactin is released from the anterior pituitary, and that would reach the target tissue of the mammary glands, which would stimulate milk production. If we look at the tropic hormones, ACTH, FSH, LH, and TSH, they are produced in one endocrine structure, but have a other endocrine gland as their target, and that's why they're called tropic hormones. The neurohypophysis produces two hormones, as I said before, antidiuretic hormone, ADH. The alternate name for this is vasopressin, so you might see that in some texts, and oxytocin. ADH has the target tissue of the kidney, the tubules more specifically, and that causes the reabsorption of water. And then finally, oxytocin, which has two target tissues, the uterus and the mammary gland, and that will stimulate uterine contraction. And then once the prolactin has produced the milk, causes the production of milk, the oxytocin will allow for what we call milk letdown. So now we can talk about some endocrine diseases now that you have kind of a basic understanding of some main hormones. So as we talked about here, we really have in this pathway 3 glands that are ultimately producing your target hormone. And because of this closely integrated network of glands, if you have dysfunction of any one of those glands along that pathway, that can cause a major disorder. Okay? So depending on where the glands or what gland is affected in this pathway, that will be classified as a different disorder, either primary, secondary, or tertiary. So if the target organ, which is the last gland in this pathway, is affected, like the thyroid gland or the adrenal gland, that is considered a primary endocrine disorder. If the gland that is affected is the pituitary gland, then that's considered a secondary disorder. And if the gland that is affected, that has a dysfunction, is the hypothalamus, then that would be a tertiary disorder. Here's a little better illustration using this negative feedback loop to illustrate the different types of disorders. So if we look at this chart, we can see the target glands on the bottom, for example, the thyroid gland or the adrenal cortex or the gonads. If they are diseased or dysfunctional, then that would cause a primary endocrine disorder. If in fact the anterior pituitary in this case, or the pituitary gland, was dysfunctional in some way, that would be a secondary disorder. And then finally, if the hypothalamus was dysfunctional in some way or diseased, then that would be a tertiary disorder. So now let's talk a little bit about the different hormones and the disease states that might exist. So let's start with antidiuretic hormone. As you may remember, it's produced in the hypothalamus and then released in the posterior pituitary gland. Okay? So if we look at what might stimulate the hypothalamus to release ADH, well, if the blood osmotic pressure increases, that will encourage the release of ADH because you want more water to remain in the body, so you want to reabsorb water in the kidneys, not release it. In that case, then, if you're thirsty, so the response will be that you will be thirsty also, and so you will drink more, which will then reduce the blood osmotic pressure, and that will inhibit more release of ADH. So you can see those plus and minuses as plus is stimulate and minus is inhibit. Okay. Also, once you've reabsorbed quite a bit of water, that will also reduce the blood osmotic pressure. You can see that from the bottom here, and that will cause an inhibition in the hypothalamus of the release of ADH. So that's the cyclical properties of this hormone. So a disorder of ADH is diabetes insipidus. Don't confuse this with diabetes mellitus, which we'll talk about later in relationship to carbohydrate metabolism. This disorder only has to do with ADH. So in a person that might have head trauma, a pituitary tumor, or a craniotomy, which is an operation in the brain, there may be some damage to or dysfunction to the posterior pituitary gland or the hypothalamus, okay, along this pathway. And so that would disrupt ADH production and decrease it. Okay? So in this case, when you decrease the production of ADH, then you can't reabsorb water, and a lot of water is lost, right? So you can see here, in this case, you can see all this water being lost out of the kidney. The patient gets extremely dehydrated to the point of severe results. And you can see here some of the symptoms, signs and symptoms in that bucket on the left. You can see the severe decrease in specific gravity of urine, blood osmolarity decreased, the blood volume is decreased, hypovolemia, a severe thirst, your heart races, tachycardia, and a severe drop in blood pressure. So this can be a very, very serious disorder. Next, let's talk about growth hormone. So you can see growth hormone is released by the anterior pituitary. Okay? And remember, this travels and has receptors in almost all cells of the body. So some direct effects are metabolic effects on fat cells and carbohydrate metabolism. So it increases fat breakdown and release for energy. It also increases blood glucose. And then if you can see some of the indirect actions or the growth promoting reactions, it causes the liver and other tissues to produce what we call this insulin-like growth factors, IGF, which will cause increased production of cartilage formation and skeletal growth in the skeletal tissues, and then also increased protein synthesis, cell growth, and proliferation outside of the skeletal tissues, extraskeletal. So it's a really, really important proponent of growth in the body. Now we're going to talk about two different disorders related to growth hormone. The first is a decreased amount of growth hormone called dwarfism as a pituitary disorder. So when there is a pituitary tumor that causes a decreased production of growth hormone, hypopituitarism, that can cause a form of dwarfism, as you can see here. Two disorders can occur as a result of the overproduction of growth hormone: gigantism and acromegaly. Which of these will occur is dependent on when a tumor forms in the pituitary, either before or after puberty. Acromegaly occurs due to the formation of a pituitary tumor after puberty. The excess growth hormone causes extreme growth of the extremities, the hands and feet, and the face, especially in the forehead and the jaw. At one time, it was hypothesized that President Lincoln had acromegaly due to his exceptionally large hands and feet and irregular facial features. Most experts now agree this is unlikely to be the cause, and if so, was a mild case of acromegaly. Listed here are some other clinical manifestations that you can look at, and you can see what can be used to diagnose acromegaly. Gigantism is the overall increased growth due to a pituitary adenoma before puberty, which causes an excess of growth hormone. This famous wrestler, Andre the Giant, reached a height of 6'3" before the age of 12, and then reached a full height of 7'4". You may remember him in his role as Fezzik in the 1987 movie The Princess Bride. As is the case with many afflicted with this disorder, Andre died relatively young at the age of 46. This is due to the fact that the heavy body places extreme demands on the body, especially in the heart. And finally, let's talk about the situation where we might have more than one pituitary hormone produced, or decreased in this case. Panhypopituitarism is a decrease in many, if not all, pituitary hormones, and is often caused by a pituitary adenoma, which is a very slow-growing, benign tumor. Some of the symptoms associated with this disorder are weight loss, weakness, and muscle wasting. The patient usually presents with many of the problems of an adrenal disease called Addison's, except for the increased pigmentation which you would find in Addison's. In addition, signs of diabetes insipidus may also be present because of the effects, the wide effects that this disorder may have. In the next lectures coming up in the following weeks, we'll talk about each of the systems like the thyroid, the adrenal cortex, the adrenal medulla, the reproductive hormones, and etc.